Good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Fowler with the National Council of Urban Indian Health. Today we are having a webinar on board training, on our Board of Directors training series. Today's featured speaker will be Mr. Tony Scucci of BoardWorks. Mr. Tony Scucci will be talking to us today on a board self-assessment, what that means and how it's important for us, as well as information on cost and things of that nature. So Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Kimberly, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, this webinar is really going to be focusing on board self-assessments, and we'll really talk about the what, why, when, and how of all that. I want to welcome you again this afternoon to this workshop, to this webinar, and also want to just invite you throughout the whole time we're on. If you have any questions, there's a box on the bottom right of your screen for questions. Please enter them in there, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on them. And Kimberly agreed to help me in case I miss some of them. But please feel free to ask questions or make comments anytime during this webinar. Also want to point out to you that at the bottom of the screen is my email address, and I would welcome any comments or questions or requests for resources or anything, any way I might be helpful to you. That's the email address. I respond to all my emails within 24 hours, so please understand that as a genuine invitation. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move along, and I've got to get to where I can advance my screen, and my screen is not advancing. Okay, here we go. So we'll look at the goal for this webinar, really in a sec, help get a better understanding of board self-assessment, the process itself, and the kind of potential value it can have for you and for your boards to improve your board's performance. And a board self-assessment is something that you do no matter what level your board may be functioning. So it's not designed necessarily for a board that's having problems. It's designed as an assessment tool to simply take a snapshot picture of where your board is at this particular moment in time. Specifically, we'll look at the kind of elements of an effective board assessment process. And what I did was to design a webinar in a way to answer these questions. We'll try to define what it is we're talking about, what a board self-assessment is, and I'm talking about in this webinar a formal process. So this is not simply every now and again for a board asking itself, how are we doing, how could we improve? We're really talking about a formal process that you might engage in once every couple of years to really measure your board's strengths and to identify areas where your board can improve its performance. We'll talk about the whys behind this. What's the reason for doing this? What are some, how might you know when it's a good time to do a board self-assessment? How the process works? What are some of the costs and the benefits or the values to doing this, and the kind of impacts that conducting a board self-assessment can have? So that's where we're going in terms of the objectives and what we want to accomplish today. I laid out the agenda. I wanted to point out that I'll be referencing a process and a tool that I use in my work. And again, it is a formal and a comprehensive self-assessment tool. The tool that I use mostly is a tool that is offered through BoardSource. It is one of the best tools you could find, and it is very much a comprehensive tool. I also want to point out that as we talk about self-assessment, we're talking about a subjective process. So this is not an objective process. This is simply gathering the perceptions of board members in terms of how they see their board strengths and weaknesses. So we'll define this whole thing. And again, I'm defining this as an opportunity to look at what's working well on our board and where can we make improvements. We'll talk about those aspects of the self-assessment process itself and the benefits. Some of the things that get in the way of boards doing board self-assessments, which is another area we'll explore. And we'll look at some resources that I can share with you as well. And I also want to remind you that after the webinar, you'll get a link to an evaluation form. But if you would respond to that evaluation, your input, your feedback is greatly appreciated, and every time we do a webinar, we improve on each one because we get good, honest feedback from participants. So I want to invite you all to please take a few minutes and do that. It's a very simple survey, and any thoughts or comments you have, please share them with us. We'd be glad to hear from you. So let's take a minute and really define what we're talking about here. This is a process where you look honestly at how your board's doing its work, what you do well and where you can make improvements. And the key word here is looking honestly. This really is an opportunity in a sense to kind of put a mirror up in front of your board and really look at how do we do our work, what are some of the things we do really well, what are some areas where we could improve upon our performance. It's a conscious effort to move from the level that you may be performing at now to a higher level. And that would, again, regardless of what level you're at now, this process is a good way to ensure that you can improve. And it's a conscious effort. You really have to put an effort into it. It doesn't happen automatically. It takes some time and some energy. And the more you invest in it, what I find is the greater the value to it. And it's all based on a belief that self-awareness is the first step in growth and development. So when we talk about conducting a board self-assessment, we're really talking about kind of getting out of autopilot. You know, most of the time your board operates in a kind of routine autopilot fashion. And in order to improve performance, you have to get out of that autopilot mode and into a different kind of different consciousness, a different way of being and thinking about how we do our work. And so that requires real intention. And there's one of my favorite little quotes. If you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. And that is so true. The way you improve is to get out of autopilot and really take an honest look at what you're doing and how you're doing it. So a shift now to talking about why you would want to do this. What would be the point of doing board self-assessment? In one way, the obvious way is to measure the effectiveness of your board. I've done board assessments with well over 100 boards in my experience in the past 4 or 5 years. And one of the things that I find is that most nonprofit boards have never done something like this before. And when they do an assessment, what they end up with is a really good picture of their performance at a particular moment in time. It gives you a baseline of data. And if you were to conduct a subsequent board self-assessment a couple of years down the road, you would then be able to measure your progress in terms of improving your performance. Another reason why you would do this is because it helps board members kind of get a little more clarity about what their roles and responsibilities are. And I think that's really a key thing. I know that IHS requires you all to have a board training a certain number of hours every year, and a large part of that board training is really about making sure boards are clear about what the roles and responsibilities are. You could do a board self-assessment as a way to measure progress. You may have some particular goals for your board, and it's a way to kind of identify those and measure progress toward them. Identifying strengths and weaknesses, fostering growth and development of individual board members is another reason you would do this. You know, I use this word self-assessment in a very intentional way. Board self-assessment tool and a process is not a diagnostic tool. It's not intended to identify problems and then create some treatment for the problem. It's really to look at what's working well and to identify areas where improvements can be made. It's also a good way to identify the different opinions and perceptions of board members. One of the benefits of doing a board self-assessment is that it takes a lot of issues that might be under the surface and simply brings them to the surface, and it does it in a way that people don't take personal. Folks don't get defensive about it. It's simply saying this is the way we see our performance. These are the things we think we do well. These are some areas we think we could improve. And again, a quote here from Einstein, but problems can't be solved at the level of consciousness they were created. That's why we need to get out of that autopilot mode and really look at a different way of thinking about and looking at our performance. Continuing with the reasons why you would do this, it increases the level of engagement and leadership among board members. It really does have that effect. It's a validating process. Very often a board will do a self-assessment and they'll really feel really good because they're doing a lot of things well, and this tool and this process will validate that. So it has a validating or affirming kind of value as well. Sometimes boards are going through a process where they're looking at restructuring themselves. This is an opportunity to really do that in a thoughtful way. Conducting a board self-assessment on a regular basis gives you credibility. not only within the board and within staff, but in terms of funding sources and other external folks, people in your community, when you can kind of demonstrate to your community, to your funders, to your clients, that we care enough about governance, that we invest in assessing our performance, that we are always working to continually improve our performance. And I would suspect that a lot of you do that in terms of your programming. You know, I know a lot of urban programs are kind of following a continually improving quality performance. And so this is just another way to do that in terms of nonprofit governance. It builds respect and trust among board members, and it really helps promote the board as a team. It validates the good work. It's a way that boards can really kind of come together and make their work more effective. When you do a board self-assessment, when would be a good time? Well, there's lots of good times. So these are some thoughts about that. Sometimes you may find yourself where the board and the organization, you're not quite in sync. Things just don't feel quite right about how things are working. That's an opportunity to step back and take an honest look at how the board is working. When you find that your board is managing more than governing, and I know in my experience, when a board doesn't really know how to govern, it tends to shift into managing. And what you really want in your boards and in your boardrooms is for your board to not be managing, but to be governing. Two very different functions. When the board is increasingly being asked by staff for more involvement, so when you're looking for ways to get more board participation in the governing area, it would be a good time to do a board self-assessment. If you're considering reorganizing the board, that's another time that I have found that it might be worthwhile to really consider doing something like this. In preparation for some major expansion, there's another time that boards will typically find it very much worthwhile to do a board self-assessment. Part of a strategic planning process, a lot of boards I work with, they will incorporate a board self-assessment in the strategic planning process. And what I find is that they'll create a kind of goal around building the organization's capacity. And that's a little bit different than most strategic planning goals, which have more to do with programming and services and positioning your organization in the larger environment. So part of a strategic planning process, it's another good time to think about doing a board self-assessment. When people feel like they're not really engaged, where the board is not sure about what its job is, when the board really isn't clear about how it might be bringing value, or if the board would like to look at ways to bring greater value, it's another opportunity for doing this work. When you have conflict and complacency within the board, this tool and this process is a good way to kind of surface those issues, you know, as I said earlier, and kind of put them on the table and say, okay, these are some of the issues we have. Now we all agree we have them. Let's look at some ways to fix them. After there's a financial or an executive leadership crisis, that's often another good time. And when a lot of time has passed when you haven't done one. I have worked with nonprofit boards that will do a board self-assessment in a very formal, comprehensive way every 2 years. And over time, what they do is they continue to improve, and they make kind of fine-tune their operations in the boardroom. And they can measure quantitatively, they can measure their improvements and their effectiveness, and they can see the progress they make in that direction. So those are some thoughts about when it might be worthwhile or particularly worthwhile to do this. So I'll talk a little bit now about how this whole process works. First thing you need to do as a board is to decide that you actually want to do it. And this is the important kind of first step, because in my experience, if you have all the board members or most board members saying, yes, we believe this is valuable, we want to do this, we want to invest the resources and energy in this, then you have a high level of ownership. And that's what you really need going into this. So if you have 1 or 2 board members that want to do this and no one else does, it's not going to be as valuable as if you can build some ownership into the whole thing. Typically, the next step is to assign a task force, or it could be the full board, to take lead responsibility for making sure that this happens. At some point, you decide whether you're going to bring in an external consultant, and I'll talk a little bit in a subsequent slide about why you might consider that. Somebody who can guide the process, somebody who's had a lot of experience in doing this kind of work. Then you determine what your process and timeline is. decide what kind of tool or design you're going to use. You can create your own tool. There's all kinds of tools out there. The tool that I use, as I said, is a board source tool. It's an online tool. It's designed in such a way that every board member can respond to. It's a questionnaire. It's very comprehensive. Takes a little time to do it. Might take a half an hour of thoughtful time to complete it. You can complete that from anywhere in the world as long as you have access to a computer. You can complete it answering one question at a time, or you could sit down and do them all at one time. So it's made very easy to access, user-friendly. It compiles the data, the quantitative data, in an ongoing way. You then conduct the assessment, which is really have everyone on the board complete the survey or the questionnaire, and then all the data is compiled, and then you would have to look at that data and do some interpretation or some analysis of it and present a report to the board. And from that report, you would determine next steps. So that's an example of how the process would work. Talk a little bit about what an external consultant could offer. One is that, and I know when I do this work, I can bring a lot of efficiency to the whole process. I've done it many times. I know the shortcuts without making real compromises, and you get a much better process by having somebody with that experience leading it. A consultant can take the results and translate them into actions. When I do board self-assessments, I usually do a report, which is an analysis of the data, and we look at some recommendations, and I present that to the board in a retreat setting, and from that retreat we craft an action plan with specific kind of actions that the board can take immediately to begin improving its performance. So doing the survey, again, it's a self-assessment questionnaire. Sometimes it can be done with interviews. There's a lot of variations about the way to do it and what kind of tool you might use. And I would encourage you to simply find a tool or a process that fits for your organization, that works for your organization. You don't want to over-engineer it and have some 40-page instrument when you could do it with an interview of 10 people and a more narrative report. So there are a lot of variations about that. And then a consultant would kind of facilitate, as I said, a board retreat following up on the survey itself. And really, it's a good way to ensure that there's a high level of participation because no one board member has to take that lead responsibility. You can have a professional external consultant really do that for you. So those are some reasons, some ways in which an external consultant can bring some value. What are the kind of results you can get from this? Well, one of the things that I say all the time is that you find that the board gets renewed. There's a re-engagement. People get energized. As I said earlier, a lot of times this process validates the good work that's being done and also position you in a way to say, okay, there are a few things we can do better. What are those things? Let's prioritize them. Let's come up with an action plan and get to that. It also builds new skills and abilities among board members. One of the things I find often is that board members will look at a questionnaire and there'll be questions and they would look at the question and not realize until they've seen it that, oh, I'm supposed to be doing that, or our board is supposed to do that. So it brings up a lot of good information, a lot of good opportunities for learning. It helps strengthen the direction of the board. As a result of doing a board self-assessment, the board comes away from this with a clear sense of where it's going. Clarifying roles and responsibilities of individual board members and of the board as a whole. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that's particularly important to your funders, your major funders. And it's also a good thing to remind folks about how the board can bring real value to the organization. Clarifies expectations about board service as well. So it does a lot of those kinds of things. Also is a vehicle for identifying those board members who really are not engaged, who have not really been contributing or participating, and it kind of just puts it out there. Often it leads to a conversation between a board chair and a board member who's not really been engaged to kind of find out what that's about, and is this a good time perhaps to step off the board, or what can we do to have this be a much more valuable experience for you. Provides a good orientation for new board members. It's another really good benefit to all this. So those are some of the potential results you get from doing a board self-assessment. And again, I'll invite questions. If you have any questions, please put them out there. We're a little bit abstract it's going along here, but I think things will crystallize for you as we come along. Here are some examples of performance indicators. So what I'm showing you on the screen now are performance indicators. They would appear in a survey as a question, supporting the organization's mission, for example. How does the board perceive itself in its performance in terms of supporting the mission? How does the board or board members see themselves in terms of cultivating a climate of mutual trust and respect between the board and the chief executive? So these are the kinds of performance indicators or questions you would find in the questionnaire. Does our board comply with IRS regulations to complete the Form 990? This is a good example of where sometimes board members look at that and they'll say, what's a 990? Which is a good question, because if you're serving on a board and you don't know what the IRS Form 990 is, it'd be important for you to find out. So these are the kind of questions where the board would be asking itself, okay, from my perspective as a board member, how do I think we do in terms of complying with this regulation? If I think we do real well, I'll give it a high score. If I think we do poorly, I'll give it a low score. If I have no idea what the question is about or I don't know, well, there'd be a place to check off don't know. Again, it's a tool that we use for gathering data, and that data is the perceptions of board members in terms of their board's performance. Another common one that I see, and you see this a lot with urban programs, with healthcare programs, is how does the board do? How are we doing in terms of measuring the impact of our programs? Do we have good metrics? Do we have good evaluation tools, for the services we're providing, for the patients in our clinics? Following and enforcing confidence. So these are examples of the kind of indicators that you would find in the tool. And the tool that I use, as I said, it's a comprehensive tool. There are about 65 or 70 indicators. And in a minute, I'll show you how we cluster those. But these are some samples of the kind of questions you would be asked to respond to. When you look at the elements of the tool itself, you'll find in the tool I use that there are 4 broad kind of roles for the board around setting the direction, ensuring that there are resources, providing oversight, and then the board structure and operations. And these are the board roles, and on the right you'll see now the areas of responsibility. So these are the board's roles and responsibilities appearing on the right side of the screen, and they're clustered in terms of the roles. So we have setting direction. So there will be questions around the mission, strategic planning. To what extent is the board involved in strategic planning? Is there a strategic plan? Ensuring resources. How does the board present itself to the public? How do we build confidence in those people who fund us and support us? Do we have the right mix of people on our board? Providing oversight. Do we have good oversight in terms of our programs? Do we evaluate our services? Do we have an audit conducted every year? Are our financial systems in place? Are they effective? Are there ways we can improve upon them? Our chief executive, do we do a performance review every year of our chief executive? So that's an area of responsibility. It's critical for boards to be doing that. So this is an example of kind of the framework for the assessment tool, and you'll see it's comprehensive. It covers all the roles and responsibilities of a board. You also will note that if you've ever been to any of my trainings, this is the very same slide I use when we talk about roles and responsibilities. So it correlates with those roles and responsibilities. There's quantifiable data that's gathered in the tool. So there's scaling questions that go from a 0 for poor, 1 equals fair, all the way up to excellent. And we get the numerical scores and percentages. And then there's another metric that we use, and that's the degree of consensus. And the degree of consensus is expressed in percentages. And what the degree of consensus is, it gives us a picture of whether the board, how much agreement is there amongst board members about a particular indicator. If everyone on the board, if you have a very high percentage of a consensus around a particular item or a performance indicator, that would suggest that everyone on the board sees it the same way. So here's an example. I extracted this from a tool. So one of the performance indicators I extracted here is, how does the board do in cultivating a climate of mutual trust and respect between the board and the chief executive? So if you're a board member, you're being asked to score that on that scale. And then this score here is the average of all the board members who respond. and this is the degree of consensus. So what this is saying is that 3.25 is the score, which on a scale from 0 to 4, this is a relatively high score. And anything over 3 is a good score. So this is a pretty good score, and what it tells us also is that 75% of the respondents are in agreement that, that we do this very well. The second indicator is measuring the impact of critical programs and initiatives. So the question would be, how are we doing as a board in terms of measuring these impacts? This score is a little lower. It falls below the 3.00, which is the threshold. So this score is saying, yeah, we don't do that as well as we could. And more than half of the board members agree that we don't do this as well as we could. So that would suggest that maybe this is an area we should improve upon or we should invest in. So this is kind of a sample that I extracted just to give you an idea of that part of the tool. So this is all part of the first big section of the tool. The second section has to do with a section that's checklist, practice areas checklist. And basically this is the list of questions that are yes or no questions. And it's really to get a picture of what's in place now. So for example, there are 4 sections. One would be organizational practices. So for example, is there a written strategic plan? The response would be yes or no. Oversight practices, does the full board approve the annual budget? Again, you get a yes or no response on this. And what this does is to give me, as the person working with the board, a sense of what is in place and what is not in place. Best practices, is there a formal orientation for new board members? It's a simple yes or no question. Now, if the answer is no, then the board might want to ask itself the question, how come? Why is it that we don't have a formal orientation process? Should we consider having a formal orientation process? And then fourth section having to do with chief executive supervision. Do we evaluate the chief executive annually? And does the whole board do that evaluation? It's a good question. This tool would ask the question, look for a yes or no answer. And if you get a no answer for this, then you'd want to ask the question, why don't we do this? Isn't this one of our primary responsibilities? So that's a second section, the practice checklist. There's a third section, which really has to do with written comments, and for every indicator, there's room for written comments, and they really provide a really rich context for describing the kind of, adds more to the quantitative data, gives you a really good sense of where people are at and what their thoughts are. There's organizational demographic data that we collect. So for example, there's a one page in this tool that I use, and it asks questions like, what's the frequency of board meetings? What's the average attendance at a board meeting? What's the size of the operating budget? How long has the chief executive been in that position? So this demographic data all adds to the mix to help really do a good assessment. And then there's a section where board members actually assess their own individual performance. It's a kind of a small part of it too, where board members really talk about how they see themselves contributing. So those are the elements. I'll talk for a minute now about the things that get in the way. And as I said earlier, many boards do not do board self-assessments, and so it's something to think about. If your board has not done a board self-assessment and you were considering it, what would be the things that would be getting in the way? What are the things you might have to deal with? And one might simply be ignorance, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way at all. I'm simply saying ignorance meaning a lack of knowledge. Some boards simply don't know that there is such a thing. Don't fully understand that this is something that could have some value to them. They simply don't know. Very often when I meet with boards, I'll ask them if they've ever done a self-assessment. They say no, and if I ask why, they'll say, well, we never thought of it. It's that fundamental, and until you get to that kind of basic level, so you'll have an obstacle here. So if you were sitting on the board, or you're a board chairperson or a chief executive, and you wanted your board to do a self-assessment, you might have to educate the board about what it is. You might have to do what this webinar is doing, in fact, and that is to educate your board about what it is and how it has value. Another obstacle is that people are just resistant to change. Some people and some boards are very resistant to change. So that's another one of the obstacles. And if that's the issue, then you've got to find some strategies that can help get you past that kind of resistance. What I find sometimes with boards is that some boards just have a hard time being honest with themselves. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but it's very difficult, and we know this as human beings, that it's very difficult to look honestly at ourselves. We have so much invested in being people, we have an idealized version of who we are. So we have so much invested in being the perfect person. I know when I look in the mirror, I know what I'd like to see, and I have to be honest with myself when I kind of say, okay, what do I really see here? And so that's another kind of thing. It really requires the board to say, let's take an honest look. And it also takes some courage to do that, because to take an honest look means we don't know what we're going to find. We may discover all kinds of blemishes here that we had no idea we had. And in my mind, that's a good thing, because if you're going to be effective governors, if you're going to be effective trustees of your organization, you've got to be able to know what you do well and know what you don't do well. Because when you figure out what you don't do well, then you can start doing some things about that. And you can really improve your performance that way. And the fourth obstacle I put up here is money. To invest time and energy and resources into this, it will cost some money. There are lots of variations around this, and when I think about this as an obstacle, I always point out to people that when you look at the cost of something, if you only look at the cost, you're looking at half of the picture, because you have to factor in not only the cost, but what is the value. And if we invest some money up front in really looking at our board and finding out what we do well so we can build on those strengths, and looking at where we can improve and make those improvements, we will get some benefits down the road. So you have to look at it as an investment that has real value. The other thing about money is this is kind of like what happens with me with a lot of clients when they'll say, well, we want you to come in and help us do a strategic planning process. And strategic planning, you could spend thousands and thousands of dollars doing strategic planning, and you could spend hundreds and hundreds. It all depends. And what you don't want to do is to go with a process that is way bigger and beyond what you actually need. At the same time, you want to make sure that you have a process that does fit your organization's size and your organization's complexity and your organization's needs. And I would add to all this, because I want to mention it again, and that is I'm talking about a process and a tool that I use. There's lots of variations on this. And I want to invite people, again, if you have some questions, please put them in the question box, and I will do my best to respond to them. But we're coming close to the end here, and I do want to invite questions, so please do ask. What was the last thing I was going to say? I'm talking to myself. Okay. I'm going to move on and just kind of put a last slide up here, or next to the last slide. Without a tool for doing this, yes?
There actually is one question. I don't know if you can see it or not.
I can't see it now. So if would you
the
mind?
The question is asking, what is the difference between a self-assessment and a board retreat?
Okay, thank you for the question. How do we differentiate between a board self-assessment and a board retreat? A self-assessment is the process where a board would take a look at its performance around all those roles and responsibilities, those 9 indicators I brought up earlier on the screen. You would look at that and determine what you do well and determine where you're not doing so well, and then you would have that picture. And that data, I would write up a report that would be an analysis of that data, and it would suggest that there's some things you could do to improve your performance. A board retreat would be what follows. So at the board retreat, I would sit down with the board and say, in your self-assessment, you identified these as your major strengths and identified these certain areas as areas where you could improve. So in the retreat, we decide where do you want to focus your energy around making improvements. And, look at those areas areas that are kind of weaknesses and decide which ones are the most important, which ones should be the highest priorities, which ones can we address quickly and easily and make some significant improvements very quickly. So you would look at that in the retreat. So the retreat is a time to kind of process this as a group and come out of it with a very specific action plan, which would be your kind of roadmap for the next year or two. And that would also be the tool that you would use over the next year or two to measure how are we doing on this. Early on in the process, I mentioned that either the full board would take lead responsibility for doing a board self-assessment, or you have a task force or even a particular board member who would take the lead responsibility. That's the person or the group that would make sure that the action plan is actually going to be implemented. So that's the retreat is then the coming together to look at the data, sort it out, and come up with a strategy for how to make improvements. It's also a time to kind of celebrate the good work that's been done by the board. So thank you for that question. And please, if there are other questions, I would welcome them. So without this tool, without some way of assessing your board's performance, you really don't know how you're doing. So you've got to have some tool for doing this. And I also would point out that what's most critical in this is to have a really sound process. In terms of a tool, a pretty good tool will suffice. You got to have a really good process if it's going to have value. Secondly, continuous improvement should be part of the board's culture. I mean, this is something that you could build into your board, a culture of ongoing improvement in our boardroom, in our board, on our board. One of the things I always encourage boards to do is at the end of a board meeting, take some time and evaluate your board meeting. To do that and to have that as an agenda item every time you meet, and to take a few minutes and really evaluate and look at what we did tonight in our board meeting. Where did we do well? What are some things we could do to improve the way we govern this organization? And see what kind of ideas come from that. You really got to get into a culture of continually improving, a kind of evaluative culture, that we are the kind of board that is always looking at our own selves and our performance with an eye towards making improvements. And we do that because it's in the interest of the people we serve. It's all tied to your mission. Everything we're here talking about today is so tied to your mission. And the most effective boards, as I said earlier, they assess themselves on a regular and ongoing basis. And they take a picture every now and again, look at how we're doing, and see where we need to make improvements. And you have a baseline of data, and then you kind of have a trend line. And if you're working at this well and you continue looking to make improvements from one assessment to the next, you will see a trend line going up in terms of your performance. So that's kind of a wrap-up slide. Last thing I'll say, really important, and it's kind of one of those secondary kind of things, but strong board members are attracted to strong board members. When your board is doing this kind of performance assessment, it's a self-assessment, it's always improving itself, you're going to attract people to your board who are oriented that way. I want to come on the board, I want to learn how to be a good board member, and I want to keep improving as a board member. And you attract people that are inclined to do the same thing. It's kind of what I think of as a kind of upward spiral. That your performance will continue to spiral upward. You'll continue to attract good people, people who are open to looking at their performance and looking at ways to improve it. And then the final kind of thoughts and reflections on this call. So I want to leave a few minutes for you to ask questions, and please feel free to do that. We have a few minutes to do that. So if you do have thoughts or comments or questions about anything I've talked about, or anything you want to disagree with, please feel free to do that. As I said, this has really been kind of a presentation around the idea of board self-assessments, and I've used the process that I use in my work as a way to kind of illustrate that. This would be a good time to also remind you all that this webinar is very open to you evaluating our webinars, so please go to the evaluation link when Kimberly puts it up there and give us some of your feedback. I can see part of a question on the screen now. and let me respond to a couple. What is Form 990? What Form 990 is an IRS form, and your agency reports its taxes to the IRS every year on a Form 990. And it pretty much puts out there information that's public, that's available to anyone, and it has to be done in a way that it's accurate and transparent. And board members need to be signing off on it because the board is responsible for what gets reported to IRS. It's a way to make sure. For example, if you have a high salaried executive director, that will be a question on your Form 990, and the public wants to know that. The public wants to know that you're reporting your taxes, that you're paying taxes if you're in a position where you need to pay them, that you have a board of directors, and if anybody on your board is being compensated some way, the Form 990 will give you all that. If you'd really like more about it, if you just Google IRS Form 990, you'll get some samples. You'll get the form itself if you want to look through it. I'm not sure who asked the question, but if you're a board member and you've asked the question, I would encourage you to talk to your executive director about it. And if you're an executive director and you're not sure what Form 990 is, I really encourage you to talk to somebody, some other executive in an urban program to make sure you find out about that. I can't see some of these other questions for some reason. So, oh, here we go.
If you click on the question, it will expand for you.
Okay. I'd be lost without you, Kimberly. What are the types of measurement tools? Okay, here we go. I've got this narrow little window and I'm scrolling down.
Okay, I'll read them out for you. The question asking from Donna is asking, is the assessment tool at BoardSource free or is there a charge?
The assessment tool through BoardSource costs money, and it may be, if you go to their website, you will see it may cost $700, $800, $900 maybe. It's a high-valued property or product that they have. It's been validated and tested. It's the best in the business. If you are a member of BoardSource, there's a discounted price for you, and all that information is listed at the BoardSource website. There are also some samples on the website as well. I can share with you also that if you have an interest in having somebody else do the board retreat and the interpretive analysis or the report, that you can contract with anyone to do that, and you can simply buy the tool from BoardSource. When you buy the tool from BoardSource, you get the online package, so it will do all the tabulating and compiling of all the data and generate a report which would go to your board. That's the first step, and that might be like a $900 cost. I have worked with boards where we've developed their own self-assessment tool, which might be a little less comprehensive, a little simpler, perhaps a little more geared to a smaller organization, customized to your particular organization as well. I would also let folks know that if you went through BoardSource and bought the tool and you wanted a BoardSource consultant, it would be a very expensive, relative to other sources, it would be a fairly expensive purchase. The work that I do with BoardSource is that when they provide me with a client, they bill the client and they bill it a month. I would. So that's the story on that, and I hope that gives you what you need. And if I get down to the next question, I think there might be one more.
The next question says, what type of measurement tools should or could be used to evaluate board meetings?
There are some really good tools to do that. If whoever asked the question, if you'd like some samples, I'd send them right on to you as kind of templates. I will share with you that a couple of good ways to really evaluate the board meeting is just simply to take some time at the end and for the board chair to ask everyone on the board for some feedback about how he or she did in facilitating the meeting or planning the meeting, to get some feedback. Another great idea for evaluating board meetings is to simply have everybody write down one idea, something that we could do to make the next meeting more effective or more valuable. Have people write something down and collect it up anonymously. You'll get a lot of good information that way. And once you start that kind of prime that pump, once you ask people for feedback and they give it to you and they're honest and they see that it changes things, they'll continue to give you good feedback. So it's really building a more of an evaluative culture, and it really begins with the board leader, kind of stepping up to that plate.
Okay, our next
another question.
Sorry, our next question is, how long is a typical retreat for 8 to 9 members?
It's a good question. If your board did a good board self-assessment, you had a lot of good data and you had a lot of good information, you could spend a half a day or a day. In my experience, it really requires at least a half a day for me to sit with the board of, say, 8 or 10 people and really dig into what is this telling us, to really craft a good action plan that will come out of it, so that so that there'll be improvements made going forward. So the short answer would be, I think you'd need at least a half a day to do it, and a full day would be good. There are some efficiencies when you have a smaller group. If you had 20 people on the board, things just take longer with more people, but a smaller group can be much more efficient.
And that was our last question.
Okay. Oh, then there's one about that this PowerPoint will be available, so that's it, I guess. Was that the last one, Kimberly?
It was. I've answered
Great.
The others that were relevant.
Well, I want to thank you all for your questions. I hope I've done okay answering them. And again, please follow up. My email address is here. Whoever asked the question about meetings, evaluating meetings, I got some great tools I share with you. I'd have a conversation anytime if it would be helpful as well, so please feel free to contact me. Want to remind people about the upcoming webinars, and just keep checking with NCUIH. You'll be getting reminders from Kimberly, I'm sure. And we're going to switch the screen. There we go. And again, invite you all to evaluate this webinar. Please give me, if you would, the best honest feedback you can. I'm always looking for ways to improve the way I do my work. Thank you again. I appreciate your participation and your questions. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to joining with you all on a subsequent webinar. And thank you, Kimberly, for being my go-to technical person. I really appreciate that.
You are more than welcome, Tony. We do appreciate you for really providing us really sound information on boards and for our boards of directors. And I'd also like to just let everyone know that our next webinar coming up will be, for boards, will be on April the 21st. It will be on conflicts of interest. So I would encourage all of you, once you see the announcement for that, to definitely register and put it on your calendar. I'd also like to mention that our executive directors training series also has a webinar coming up in March. The next webinar will be on March the 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the topic will be on conducting performance reviews. This webinar will also be led by Mr. Scucci, so we are definitely appreciative of him and look forward to hearing the information that he'll be sharing with us in March. So at this point, I'd like to say thank you again for all listening in, and we will hear from you soon. Please take some time out to take our evaluation if you can. That information will be forthcoming.
Great. Well, thank you again, Kimberly, and a good afternoon to everyone.